Since the US president announced that he would not be attending the G20 and stated his reasonings, amongst other things, saying there are all terrible things that are happening in the South African environment and South African agriculture particularly. And I think a lot of people have pushed back against that view. We've seen others writing letters and stating the reality of this country. But the one thing that we cannot run away from is that there are reasonably higher levels of crime in South Africa. And regardless of where you are, people do feel a sense of risk. And I think we have to continuously work as a country now to ensure that we improve safety. But I think the one aspect that I saw others raising on various social media was this idea of what the hell is going on in the South African agricultural sector. Are we under siege? And I will state this and say there are a number of problems that the South African farmers face. Animal diseases are one of those. If you talk to anyone that is now farming in cattle industry in South Africa, they will tell you that they've been struggling with the foot and mouth disease to an extent that a number of businesses are experiencing some really tough financial conditions. So that is a problem that we do face. We also have a problem of municipalities that are not delivering what they're supposed to do. And as a result, the transaction cost of just operating in some of the regions is fairly high for agribusinesses, farmers, and the others. And of course, issues of roads and many other aspects. Those are problems that we face, but those are domestic problems, which I think as South Africa, the South African government, and organized agriculture, we have to continuously be working on those to ensure that those people that have given their time to work in agriculture to ensure that South Africans have food on the table, but also we have a vital rural economy that is actually vibrant and able to deliver the jobs and remain pretty much alive and creating all of these agritourism opportunities that I've been talking about. That's the reality at a high level. But the idea that we are under siege is actually not the reality of the South African agricultural sector. We've stated here on AgriView that if you take a long-term perspective and say, okay, let's start at the dawn of democracy, because it seems like the conversation that we are having a lot is from that perspective in South Africa. If you measure it on that 31 years of democracy, the South African farming sector has actually more than doubled in value terms and volume terms. So there's a lot of good things that have been happening there. And I would say all of that growth is primarily driven by the efforts of private sector and the efforts of government. One of those are the higher levels of investment on technology, improving productivity in the farms, better genetics, better seed cultivars. But remember, while the private sector is bringing that technology, it also requires a government that is open-minded and actually able to open up the pathway for that technology to be applied in South Africa. You should consider the fact that if you look at South African agricultural sector, it's quite an exception from part of the sub-Saharan Africa region. And I don't say that with pride, because South Africa's agriculture is a shining light. But if you look beyond our borders, there's great difficulty in a number of communities. And one of the key things that confronts many African countries is the fact that they have their governments that are not open-minded to technology. They block genetically modified crops, they block certain agrochemicals, and all of these things, they actually put their farmers on a back burner. In South Africa, there's been a progressive approach of embracing technology. And by the way, if you are working on government and you are watching us on AgriView, you should know that whatever technology comes to the table, try to be as progressive as you were in the 2000s. The idea of being hesitant nowadays and maybe listening more to some of the activist voices is not going to help us in our long-term growth opportunities. We are facing climate change, which also means then that we must embrace technology as an adaptation method on that. So if you are in government, that open-mindedness that we have in the early 2000s, we have to continue on that path. So that's the government side, and that's the private sector investing and bringing all of this technology. And as a result of that, we've seen that farm productivity in our great country has actually improved over time, delivering all of this. The second catalyst, which also we have discussed here in AgriView, is the idea that we are now the only African country in the top 40 global agriculture exporters. Again, not saying it with pride to say, oh, this is a South African exceptionalism, as we are often accused. I think what creates and what makes us to be the only African country, in part, links to the point that I've made before, which is that we've had a government that is open and embraced technology. And as a result of that improvement in production, we have been able to have surpluses that we are putting out into the world market. In 2024, that was just under 14 billion US dollars. And I think this year, 2025, we will cross the $14 billion mark in terms of where our agricultural exports will be as South Africa. And we are exporting about half of what we produce, and we can still export more. And our exports are fairly diverse. African continent takes a great deal, over 40%. The EU, roughly 19, 20%. The Middle East and Asia, 24%. The UK, and many other countries that we are actually exporting to. But you know what? This export journey cannot happen if it's just government there or just private sector there. Because the government has to do its part. The trade negotiations are government-to-government conversations, which means then that the South African government has actually had a period where it was effective in opening up export markets. Get this, in the early 2000s, we only exported about $2 billion US dollars of agricultural products. Today, we're at close to 14, which means then that opening up new export markets, particularly in the EU, as well as what we've been able to achieve in the continent, and now progressively in the Middle East and Asia, has been useful on that. But the government alone also doesn't have the products to move in that. The farmers have to produce the specification and the quality that is needed, which means then that that collaboration of us as South Africa Inc. now, having private sector, producing the product that is required, making sure the specifications that are required by markets are there, and the government understanding that their duty is to enable the South African businesses, not to oppose or make life difficult for South African businesses, but really to enable them to thrive and do what they can. But the South African businesses, not to think the government is working for them, it's really a collaborative approach of all of us trying to make our country to prosper and be at a better place tomorrow. And I think that collaboration of the past is what has delivered to where we are. And I raise this because nowadays, everyone talking about export diversification, even us here on AgriView. But that talent that we had in the early 2000s, which enabled us to open those export markets, we have to ask a question of whether, do we still have those people at the Department of Trade, Industry, Department of Agriculture to do the scientific work, Department of International Relations and Cooperation at DERCO to actually also assist in this journey, which means then the capacitation of all of these departments is key. And that capacitation approach also have to involve now 3 stakeholders, government, private sector, and academia, so that we push South Africa to the right direction. So if now we are exporting and we have been collaborating nicely in this way that has been able to deliver this success, how could you say that we are in a disaster? I think as a country, we have challenges in agriculture, but we are not under siege. And what we should now be focusing on is how do we build on this and actually make sure then that we continue to go forward. And we've stressed here on AgriView that even the topic of inclusivity, which is so important in South Africa, it's not just about taking from one farmer to another. It's really about the growing of the agricultural pie. And we've stated that the South African government has over 2 million hectares of land that we should start with on involving new entrant farmers, leaning on the organized agriculture skill, leaning on the capabilities that they can bring, the financial services, and making sure that those farmers are able to reach somewhere. And yes, we're not going to be able to help all of the farmers as a country now to say everyone who wants to farm must come in. I think in the inclusivity journey, the government has to take a view of better few, but better. Select a few better black farmers that you can actually support and make sure that they get at the top commercial level, and therefore they play as an anchor in the regions that they are in. Not everyone will actually be able to get to that level. Unfortunately, those are tough policy choices that have to come alongside this. And these are some of the things we've discussed, which if you look at our channel, you will find some of these episodes which we have talked about these aspects. But I think the core thing to suggest that the South African agricultural sector is under siege is inaccurate. And if anything, it worries some of us who cares about this sector. Because for someone who's sitting somewhere in Asia, buying some South African products, but not intimately following what's going on because they have a choice, they can buy anywhere, it begins to ring in their mind that perhaps this South Africa country is not reliable, and it may not be a reliable supplier, because every now and then it runs into problems. Maybe I should look to Chile, I should look to Peru and reduce my reliance on South Africa. So it muddies and it really ends our image in the international environment. And I think as a South African farming sector, we have to do what we can to protect our image, but not protecting our image by denying the reality, which is why I started by specifying that there are a number of areas that needs to be addressed. I mean, we've talked here on AgriView about stock theft. That is the biggest issue in South Africa, where we have argued that almost 100 cattle are stolen a day in this country. That's not the picture that you want to see, which means that stock theft is a great challenge for all farmers in South Africa. Crime is a great challenge for all farmers in South Africa and for all South Africans, which is why it has to be addressed. And all of the inefficiencies that are increasing the cost of doing business and even making the environment much more tougher for small and the new entrant farmers who don't have equipment and technicalities and the financial abilities to be able to do well. And in fact, even constraining those that are already at a large scale that would expand more, employ more people, because now they have to pay money maintaining roads and doing all kinds of things that have nothing to do with farming. But if the municipality did their own path and everyone did what they have to do, we would be a prosperous country. And we had a period at which we were actually able to do that in the early 2000s. And I think we are about to have to regain that. So where is the path? Ipindlela, what should we be doing? The path is in the agriculture and the agro-processing master plan that I've been talking about. Some of you don't like it, say, oh, I wasn't consulted, so-and-so was consulted. Look, I think it doesn't matter who was consulted or not consulted. The key thing is about what are the problems that are facing South Africa. Is the plan that is proposed resolving those problems? Then if it does resolve the problems, even if I was not consulted, the problems will get resolved and then I will be able to thrive. And I think that's what should be the core focus. But on the consultation stuff, there's a lot of people that were consulted. The plan is not for the government or is not by the government. It is actually co-created by labor, business, government, organized agriculture. A lot of stakeholders participated on it. What is left now is implementing it and making sure that we keep this sector on a positive growth trajectory, because it creates a lot of jobs. Looking at the primary agriculture as well as its value chain, that's over 1.3 million South Africans that are working there. And we have to make sure that we sustain that. And by the way, you cannot employ over 1.3 million South Africans if you were under siege and export half of what you produce and earn almost 14 billion US dollars of revenue on exports. That's not what you can do when you are under siege. We are thriving, not under pressure, but we have domestic problems that we have to resolve. With that, folks, let me stop there. And as always, share the episode if you find it resonating with you. And subscribe if you are watching us for the first time. And all the information is in the link below. Thank you for watching.